This is a message for Congresswoman Susan Wild, Democratic Congresswoman Susan Wild of the United States. It's been brought to my attention that a couple of weeks ago, you made a statement to say you are reintroducing the Philippine Human Rights Act to US Congress. Now, this is an act that would see funding cut off from the United States to the Philippines. This would then mean, in terms of defense spend, in terms of military hardware and military capabilities, this would then mean that the Philippines, who badly needs to upgrade its military hardware and equipment, would not get that funding and would not be able to do so through the sale of weapons to the United States. It's all very well for the United States arming themselves to the teeth, but the partners or the allies or the so-called allies of the United States, i.e. the Philippines, would not be able to do so under this proposed act of yours that is signed by 12 co-respondents. And under this particular bill or act, the situation is that you are talking about the Philippines being a sovereign nation and being able to be independent from other countries, i.e. having its own sovereignty, and yet you have trying to reintroduce this act that would mean that the Philippines is not able to properly defend itself with the help from the United States. Now, you say that you're doing this because you're not happy about President Duterte and, of course, the Duterte administration. In fact, you call that the Duterte regime, and you are talking about the apparent targeting of human rights defenders who are in the Philippines. But the situation is, you have to understand that what about the human rights of Filipinos to defend themselves against foreign aggressors? What about the human rights of the Philippine government to be able to protect the Filipinos and to be able to protect its country? The stopping of this funding will have implications for the Philippines on this unproven allegations that you've made. The fact is, in any single war, there are going to be casualties. And of course, in the war on drugs, there are sometimes accidental incidents that happen. And yes, of course, there is, if you like, accidental fire, i.e. innocents have been accidentally targeted. But then again, you would call that, say, friendly fire. But you talk about friendly fire, but of course, America is very, very guilty for friendly fire, for shooting their own. This happens within America all the time. The fact is, you can't really preach that you're perfect in any way, or the America is without fault. There are incidents in America where people are targeted, by accident, if you like. And I'm sure the same thing has accidentally happened in the Philippines. But this doesn't mean that you cut off funding to the Filipino people. This will have an adverse effect on the Filipino people because it will mean they are no longer able to defend themselves. And it means that the Philippines is not able to defend itself against terrorists if you've cut off that military spending. The fact is, you do seem to have it in for the Philippines, for the Philippine people, and for the Philippine government. You're listening to Western media. You're listening to unproven rhetoric. You are listening to tales from human rights do-gooders in the Philippines. But you have to understand, what about the human rights of the victims of drug addicts who are murdered and raped and robbed? You need to listen to their human rights too. You're nowhere near the Philippines. You have no connection with the Philippines whatsoever. Why does it concern you when you are basically trying to cut the Philippines off? You are trying to cut off the good relationship the Philippines has with America. You know, they are allies and they stand shoulder to shoulder. And yet here you are trying to cut off the defense spending. Here you are trying to cut off the training that will equip soldiers in the Philippines to be able to defend themselves by cutting off this money, or this proposal to cut off this money would mean that Philippine soldiers are unable to defend themselves against terrorists and against aggressors. You know, I'm really surprised that this statement by you has been missed by some. You know, this is a very, very important move that you are trying to reintroduce, or this particular act that you are trying to reintroduce will have unfortunate consequences for the Filipino people. And I don't understand why you are trying to do this. I don't understand what you have against the Philippines, what you have against the Philippine government. You talk about the Philippines being a sovereign nation, and yet you are trying to stop the Philippines from being able to defend itself. You know, Susan Wild, you know, I don't understand what is your intention? What is your purpose? Are you being paid? Are you being paid by liberals? Are you being paid by some other entity to try and cause problems in the Philippines? Or are you being paid to try and make the Filipino people look bad? Or are you in some way in cohorts with the opposition to cut off support for the Philippines from the United States of America? You know, the fact is that America have been allies with the Philippines for a long time. And here you are trying to cause issues in the country. And here you are trying to interfere in the Philippines. And yet you're calling the Philippines a sovereign nation. You're saying that the Philippines is a sovereign nation. And yet here you are trying to, if you like, cut off the funding so that the Filipino people cannot defend themselves. You want to leave the Philippines as a sitting duck, a lame duck from terrorists. And I don't understand why you want to do that. I don't understand what your intention is. You know, the Filipino people must know this. The Filipino people must know your true intentions so that they can do something about this. You know, there needs to be a petition. There needs to be some kind of representations in the United States against this proposal, because I really don't believe that this proposal is a good way forward. You talk about the America being a sovereign nation and protecting the American taxpayer. Well, you know, the fact is the Philippines, with this spending, they will defend its nation against terrorists. And yet here you are trying to cut off that funding. Here you are trying to cut off the safety of the Filipino people. And, you know, I really am disappointed in this move. And I really am disappointed that there are also people within the Philippines who are also trying to defend your moves. I just find that absolutely shocking and, of course, shameful. And I really hope that you leave the Philippines alone. Hands off the Philippines, hands off the Filipino people.